China's a problem, I would say, for Brazil. It's possibly the only way to put it. And the whole premise behind this paper, and this is the paper is a chapter out of a book that I'm working on called Brazil and the World, and it's one of the key bilateral relationships in the book, is trying to explain sort of the confusion and what's going on. And this is told mostly from the Brazilian side because I can read the memoirs, I can talk to the people, the memoirs from the diplomats in Brazil, I can talk to the Brazilian diplomats, I can talk to Brazilian business people in their language. I can't do the same with the Chinese. I don't speak Mandarin, I don't read Mandarin, so it skews things a bit. The other nice thing is that a lot of people in Brazil have retired recently from government who were key in setting the relationship up, and they have a lot to say, and they've published it, so it's actually quite easy to get at some of this material. All right, so what's the premise? Confusion without conflicts. I'll go a little bit of background here to sort of say where this is coming from. So, excuse me, the rhetoric you'll get out of the foreign ministry in Brazil is largely one of, we're partners in solidarity, we're cooperating to go forward, we have the same ambitions, the same desires. The very strong rhetoric that came from Lula was very much built around this idea of South-South cooperation, solidarity. We're all in the impoverished South being beaten down by the North, and we have to combine together to push back. There's some logic to this. If you look at where the bilateral relationship that exists now came from, it goes back to the late 1970s, when there was a bit of a foreign policy opening in Brazil that was coming with a political opening. There was a bit more looking around the world outside of traditional centers, and there was a realization that, look, China faces the same developmental problems as Brazil. Maybe there are some ideas we can share. Maybe we can also look at some sort of diversionary trading, possibly. This, as it turned out, was actually pretty much a one-way deal with Brazilian products going to China, not the other way, because China, well, it didn't have much to sell outside of artisanal products. And they also found that there was some congruence in the UN. Voting patterns seem to go the same way. And this seems to be a real sort of trend in Itamaraty, in the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, that they like to look at these things. Which countries do we vote in similar patterns to? Well, obviously we have something in common. Part of what will come through the story is this, and that's not really the case necessarily. The idea of solidarity, that really came out of this attempt to find common problems to development challenges. The other big thing that came out of this, and this fits very neatly into the North-South dichotomy we find in development political economy, was monopoly of technology. So who controls the technology? Can we come up with indigenous forms of doing things that we need that aren't dependent upon access from the North or the South? Now for Brazil, this is particularly pressing because they had been trying to start a nuclear industry, which the US was very firmly against, and they wound up working with Westinghouse. With a German company to make it happen. Excuse me. Now, the particular program which this anchored around, and the interesting thing to this is that this is what still features most prominently as the biggest deliverable in bilateral relations, was satellite systems. So satellite-based Earth surveillance. And I think they're on to the 4th satellite that they've launched, and if you look at the declarations that come out in the 80s, in the 90s, under Lula, and just a month or so ago under Dilma, that the Cerberus system, the Earth satellite system, is one of the prime deliverables. We've got them up there, they're working, we're going to do another one. In fact, that almost becomes in some ways the only substantive solidarity bilateral thing that hangs in the middle of this relationship. From the 1990s, you start to get to the whole dependence or interdependence question. So the solidarity is still there, the language is still there. But the question becomes, who wants what from where? Lamprea's, Luis Felipe Lampreia, who is the foreign minister under Cardoso for most of the Cardoso period, so it was from 95 to 2001. In his memoirs, he's got a very short section, talking about 2 pages or so, that talks about China. And the point that he makes is that they came to us. We didn't go to them. They came to us, and they were coming with a very specific agenda. By the early 1990s, it looks like the Chinese leadership had decided on its path forward for development. It had just realized that it's going to need food, and it's going to need access to raw materials. And you want a reliable source for these. You don't want to be depending necessarily on a northern country, because you might get cut off, so why not build on the links of solidarity? And so you find a very big push to say, well, Can we buy your minerals? Can we buy your food technology? Can we get involved in this end of the relationship? And they pushed it quite hard. Now for Cardoso, he was like, oh, fine, whatever. He thought Japan was the way to go. And he'll freely admit this now, that in the 1990s he thought, no, it's going to be Japan. Japan is the leading country in Asia. That's the one we should anchor to. We've got the diaspora. This will work. He's not been wrong, but he missed what actually happened later. Now, what's most notable about this, and this is what comes up on the next slide, which, can you see those numbers? Yeah. Just? Sorry. Some, depends how good your glasses are. What comes up from this slide is the long-term bet that you were getting out of China. So there was a strategic element here. So for Brazil, it was like, we'll take the market if we get it. China had a plan. And the plan starts to come through very, very strongly with the start of the Lula presidency in 2003. And this is where we get the whole idea about China's effect, the bit of my title about China's place in Brazil's rise. It doesn't happen without China. So as China starts to surge forward economically and needs more resources, and you see it in the trade numbers, they start to buy more and more of one thing in particular, that's minerals. So in 2003, you got $2.6 billion in minerals sold to China. By 2006, we're up at $5.8 billion. By 2009, it's almost 15 billion. By 2013, with Dilma, it's $35.6 billion in minerals. Now, there's been a massive spike in commodity prices at the same time, which will have pushed this number up. But if you look at the volumes shipped, they follow the same path. They're up an awful lot. Same thing happens with food, agricultural products. Same thing happens with fuel and chemicals, particularly as the subsalt starts to come online in Brazil. What's noticeable is manufacturers, you don't get the same rate of growth. And a lot of the manufacturers that's getting shipped are airplanes, and Embraer. So it's airplanes. It's not necessarily the stuff that Brazil is used to building, exporting, and sending off to developing countries. Now, the other flip side to this is, what is Brazil buying from China? And it's manufacturers. And this is the big debate that's going on right now in Brazil. We've got this trading relationship with China, but it's killing us because we're deindustrializing. And if you look at what Brazil's buying, it's gone from $1.4 billion worth of manufacturers in 2002 to $31.8 billion in 2013. And it's the bulk of the actual trade balance. But the bulk of what's of the $37 billion and stuff that China sells to Brazil, $31 billion is manufactured. Flip it around the other way, just the exports of minerals gives Brazil a trade surplus with China. So it's a very uneven relationship here, and I know, who here has studied Bell-Prebisch? So this is one thing that starts to come through immediately, right? This is your core periphery framework. It's not declining, it's increasing in terms of trade, but there is a kick-on to the economic structure in Brazil. Now, I'm saying this is a negative thing, but again, we're talking about Brazil's rise. So it's negative in the sense that you've got an argument about deindustrialization in Brazil going on at the moment, but there's a big positive too. As Carlos Pio back there will, I think, agree with me, there are some efficiency problems, some product quality problems that have marked the Brazilian economy for a long time. Chinese competition comes in and blows these right out of the water. So all of a sudden, you've got the glimmerings of an economic resurgence in 2003. They survived the election of Lula. Now what happens? Well, it's a bit of stability. You're starting to get the availability of credit, so you can buy, your 4 pairs of flip-flops on a 4-payment system instead of having to pay all at once. Credit starting to flow a little bit. And what happens is the Chinese goods start to slide into place. Reasonable quality, low price, which means consumption for the poor can go up. So the poor can actually consume more, which improves their quality of life. Brazilian industrialists who are putting things together by putting together parts that have been imported, you're able to get the imported components, the factors of productivity are coming in more cheaply. So again, even if it's made in Brazil, components for that product are coming down in price, which means the whole price of the whole thing can come down. So this is all a really good thing. This helps again to drive more of the Brazilian boom. The flip side of this, of course, is the deindustrialization that's taking place. And on the Brazilian side, you're talking about the problems in the shoe industry, the plastic extrusion goods industry. Toys was a big issue at one point, and that people losing industrial jobs, the manufacturing jobs. It's also a big problem regionally, and this is very significant. Now, there's a fantastic paper by Rhys Jenkins who does this in far more detail than I can. He's an econometrician. He's got the technical skills to map this out in detail. And it talks about the market share loss that Brazil has had. We had earlier today we were talking about, was Chile leaning towards Brazil and Mercosur, or leading towards the west, towards the Asia Pacific? And we had the event last night about the Alliance for the Pacific Alliance, and how this fits into development plans and so on. South America has always been extremely important, at least since 1992, for Brazil, because it is an important market for manufactured products. Depending on which country you pick, you're going anywhere between 75 and 92% of the products that Brazil sells to that country are value added, which creates employment. And what we find here, and this is the bit that's painful for Brazil, is while Brazil has had good growth rates through the resource boom, and not been as strong as places like Peru or Colombia or Chile or even Ecuador at times, Brazil's been losing market share to China in the very products that it used to sell. And this is magnifying the deindustrialization impact that you're having within Brazil. So at the same time that China's been pulling Brazil up economically, it's been cutting it down at the same time. It's becoming a competitor, which they don't seem to be able to deal with, and also one that politically they don't seem to be able to handle particularly well. Which is where we get to this. So here's the problem. And we're talking largely about the Lula years now carrying into the Dilma. But I mean, Dilma's kind of stepped back from foreign policy a lot, so this is largely Dilma and just momentum carrying it forward. For China, business is business, solidarity is a nice idea. For Lula, solidarity was business, with business becoming an idea that would come from solidarity. And you've got a couple of really key examples that come out of this. First one is market economy recognition. In the lead up to Lula's first visit to Beijing, Luis Fernando Furlan, who was the Minister for Development, Industry and Commerce in Brazil, noted that his Chinese counterpart asked 27 times in their meeting if Brazil would give China market recognition status in the WTO. That's like borderlining on pathological. It's if someone in negotiations asks you 3 times, you walk away and just go, no, I'm not giving it to you. But 27 times. This matters because China had come into the WTO on a special provision that recognized that it wasn't a market economy, which meant that there were provisions within the WTO agreements that allowed you to more quickly impose safeguards to protect your own industry against dumping. If you recognize China as a market economy, you lose those safeguards. So Furlan goes, no, I can't make that decision. No, we're not going to do it. Lula duly goes to China. And they have a long discussion. The president pushes Lula. I guess would presume the whole solidarity discourse came up. And Lula was convinced that no, this is a good thing to build our relationship, so yes, we'll do this. And he grants China market recognition. And in return, what does Brazil get? It's named as a preferred tourist destination or certified tourist destination by the Chinese government, which might result in 100,000 tourists bringing about $300 million in income a year. Maybe. More chilling, at the same time that decision is being announced, there are 2 supercargo ships full of soybeans traveling across the Pacific. And they were bought and paid for at one price that was going to be paid upon delivery. While they were transiting the Pacific, the spot market price for soy dropped through the floor. And so, lo and behold, they arrived at port, and all of a sudden they didn't pass the phytosanitary requirements in a bid to try and get a renegotiation. So there was a real tension that, we're doing you a favor, we're helping you get where you want to be in the world, and you're turning around and just hammering us on almost petty micro-level economic issues. This didn't really sink through. Foreign direct investment, here's another one. Brazil has a very, very successful, we've all flown on them. Anyone who's flown on a regional jet by now has flown on an Embraer plane. Pretty comfortable, Canadian, I'm not supposed to say this, but I will. I'm told that the Embraer are functionally better in most of the world than the Bombardier planes because they can land on rougher fields. Anyone who's been in Congonhas Airport will know what I'm talking about. Embraer wanted to build planes in China, so it set up a production plant and had an agreement that went about 4 or 5 years to start getting the production process up. But it had to get licenses to be able to assemble the planes in China, to do the production in China. While this is going on, there's 2 separate Chinese aerospace companies that are being run. I think it's China Air 1 and China Air 2. I've forgotten the exact names. essentially what's happening is they're learning from Embraer how to do this. By the end of this contract period, Embraer goes, great, look, you've got this market where you want hundreds of these sort of mid-sized, mid-range commuter jets that will carry about 100 people between the major cities. We'll build them here. And China turns around and goes, no, aerospace is a priority, we won't let you, we're going to do it ourselves. But you can build private business jets, but not the ones that you make the money on. We're going to do that on our own, even though you want to invest here. At the same time, Lenovo wants to go into Brazil to make computers. Brazil decides, no, we want them to come in. Rather than trying to have some sort of reciprocal approach to it, government contracts are released that actually make it easier for Lenovo to come in to actually effectively underwrite the entry of that foreign direct investment by buying the product. Security Council, under Amorim with Lula, it was the holy grail of what Brazil wanted. China said, no, we're not supporting you. And this was like a red line issue for foreign policy under Lula. And Lula found a way to sort of spit it off and said, no, they're not against us, they don't like Japan. Broader context being, I don't think you're going to see China wanting to see the Security Council expanded in any shape or form. Within the WTO, China was happy to sit there quietly and let Brazil push the agenda and be in the front. But as soon as the rubber hit the road about 2007, when the situation with NAMA changed and agriculture prices meant that Brazil was much more giving, China quietly started to undermine and walk away. The BRICS to the financial rescue. Again, this is Brazil underestimating or overestimating China's attachment to the cooperation. Lula and Dilma were both making noises about the BRICS being able to rescue Europe and becoming the new financial savior. But the implicit part of that was that China would have to pay for most of it. And nothing happened, surprise, surprise. And I think probably what's the most telling one, the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, and it's going to get me in trouble, but this is what happened. The Chinese president is a huge soccer fan. The BRICS summit was supposed to happen well before the World Cup, have a nice event that was taken care of and out of the way. The Chinese president said, I'm not coming unless it's after the World Cup, because I want to go to the World Cup final, and lo and behold, we have the BRICS summit 2 or 3 days afterwards and a state visit right after that. So Brazil's putting a lot of store in a relationship, hoping to get a lot out of it, whereas the Chinese are playing hardball and going in a very particular direction. So where do we go with this? Well, the relationship, despite everything I said, it is very important for both parties. China needs Brazil, but they're the customer and Brazil's the client. Brazil's the storeholder. So there's a much greater tension on Brazil. There's a much greater tension on Brazil because they won't push back. Whereas the Chinese will just stonewall, and the Brazilians won't push back. One thing they could do is organize with countries like Argentina, Canada, Australia, and create a combine for just discussing what should be done with value added to food products before they're exported to another country, or minerals. I mean, that in itself might create enough tension to move things. And the Brazilian expectations are much greater than China. China's happy to do the solidarity thing if it suits their purposes, whereas for Brazil, that has been a center point of the foreign policy. It's been a very politicized, ideologicized foreign policy, which is something that's been critiqued in that little tiny sliver of the electoral debate that's going on that talks about foreign policy. You have to dig hard, but it is there. And the relationship is costing Brazil. And this is something that's not been thought through solidly enough. I was at Sao Paulo's China-Brazil Economic Forum, Business Council Forum 2 years ago. And the business guys sitting there from Sadia, from BRF Foods, from the Abefe, the chicken people, were very forceful. But Sergio Amaral, who was running the thing, and the political guys, and the diplomats who were in charge of the file, much more reticent. So there was almost a call for, let's take it to them, let's see what happens. It can't hurt us any worse than it is. But there was a bit of a back off from the rest. Next thing, loss of market share in South America. That's hurting, and there's not much that's being done to combat that. And then this thing with the sort of the bifurcated relationship with FDI is a really interesting one, that why Brazil would not push hard to advance what Embraer needs, or push harder, or draw lines in the sand. And I think, again, it comes down to the title. I think there's some confusion about the nature of this relationship, which possibly in many ways sort of reverberates through the larger discussion of what's supposed to be going on with Brazilian foreign policy right now.